Okay. We're finishing up this, and then, as you know, we're going to have another exam on Thursday. I know you're all excited about this. It's generally, the second exam is generally a little easier, but that doesn't mean you necessarily want to go out and party every night instead of studying. You can party one night or 2 nights, but from now until then, don't party all the time.
Sorry. It's this Thursday.
What?
It's this Thursday, right?
Thursday. So in other words, bring a Scantron. If you plan to cheat, do it well so I don't catch you. I always like it if you put your full effort into something, even if it's bad. So like if you're going to murder someone, don't make a mess of it. Just make sure that it's effective unless you really want to torture someone. Okay, never mind. Now, what do you guys think about genetically modified food? Anybody?
I think that there's like a stereotype and negative connotation because a lot of food is naturally the GMO and stuff like that, so it's not all that.
Mm-hmm. So, perhaps someone is good. Anybody else? I thought I saw a hand over here somewhere. Okay. It turns out in the European Union, they banned a whole bunch of genetically modified food. Hasn't quite got to that in the United States, but a lot of people are, it's kind of like eating disorders. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what's really going on with genetically modified food. Now, in terms of selective breeding, human beings have been doing this for a very, very long time. It kind of accomplishes the same thing as selective breed, as GMOs and transgenic organisms, but it's much more efficient and specific in GMOs. So normally when we practice selective breeding, we breed for certain traits, but usually what happens is other traits get dragged along with them. So for example, if you look at dogs, dogs were domesticated from wolves. Some dogs look a lot more like wolves than others. They were bred for doing certain things, having certain personalities, all these different things. Now, one thing that's common among dogs that have been selectively bred is many of them tend to have floppy ears, a curled tail instead of long, a number of characteristics in terms of behavior where they're acting actually a lot more like puppies do. So wolves, for example, do not bark. Only puppy wolves bark, and then they stop doing that. But with our dogs, we've actually selected, well, it's been one of those traits that's been dragged along. So nowadays we could create a transgenic dog with, let's say, the traits that we want, if we understood which genes we need to change. Now, it turns out in Russia there was this guy, this geneticist, and also this woman who's still alive, who were working with silver foxes for the fur trade. And they selectively bred the animals for having a nice personality versus being a wild animal fox, right? And the same sort of changes happened with them. They started getting floppy ears. They changed color, all kinds of different things. So, in terms of GMOs, you can actually go in with this new technology called CRISPR and edit a genome. Take out certain genes, put in different alleles, actually put in genes from another organism into the genome. So it is much more efficient to do it. Of course, before, no one had the technology. We use selective breeding. We use GMOs or transgenic organisms all the time, especially in medical research and things like that, physiology. It's very, very important. In terms of the food supply, there's genetically modified animals and plants and a few other things. Now, like there is GMO corn. Most of the corn, in fact, that is grown in the United States is actually not for human consumption. It's actually animal feed. And so you've got these vast crops that are genetically modified and then fed to cattle. They have the same nutritional quality as normal corn. One of the things they've added, though, is an ability to resist herbicides like what's called Roundup, that is a weed killer. So a lot of times, if you've got a big field that you're going to plant with GMO corn for cattle feed, you'll spray Roundup all across the field, and it'll kill all the weeds. Now, what they've done is they put a gene in that makes this GMO genetically modified so that it is not killed by the weed killer. Now, plants, well, I probably told you about this, but in the past we have Neanderthal genes in our genome. Well, that's interbreeding. Well, plants do it much more often than animals do because of its architecture. And so a lot of plants make hybrids a lot more easily without having it be, let's say, a negative sort of thing on the fitness of the plant. So one of the problems with, I guess, GMOs that I think about is how is it going to affect the ecology? In other words, the interactions between organisms and their environment out in the world. If, let's say, this gene, there's genetically modified corn, it's still able to breed and it hybridizes with something that's more closely related to it. And part of that hybrid is it inherited the gene to resist herbicide. You can imagine that if a plant is able to resist herbicide that would normally kill it, it might have a really strong selective advantage, especially in human altered landscapes. Now, some genetically modified food can be really useful. In a lot of places in the world, people eat a lot of rice. In Asia, primarily the Philippines, of course in the Americas and Europe as well. But especially for subsistence farmers who just, let's say, grow mainly rice and a few other things, where they get all the calories as well as the nutrients, white rice is not especially good for you in terms of it doesn't have very many other minerals or vitamins or things like that. Like I just went and I was up in Reno and I went for all I can eat sushi, and you know it's a lot of white rice. I mean I stuffed myself. It was kind of like an eating disorder. Okay. I certainly wasn't worried about my girlish figure. So, that's probably sexist, isn't it? Okay, I'm sorry. My boyish figure. But anyway, white rice, people who live, let's say, mainly on that, or let's say they eat mainly potatoes or something like that, there aren't a lot of minerals and vitamins and those sorts of things. Well, there's this stuff called golden rice where they've actually genetically engineered and put in a gene that produces beta-carotene, which is, let's see, an antioxidant. We've talked about antioxidants. They gobble up free radicals, part of the metabolic process. So, and it's a kind of a member of the vitamin A class of vitamins. So what they've done is they've actually made this golden rice, and they're providing it to a lot of farmers so that people in those areas can actually get some beta-carotene into their diets. Oh, okay. So now in the past, with plants, they actually used to use a gene gun and shoot these cells with, let's say, the genes they wanted. They even did it with humans as well as other animals. They're not really doing that so much now. They're using what's called CRISPR instead. Okay. Now, we talked about sexual reproduction earlier, and one of the advantages we talked about sex was, I'm going to talk more about it, is generating diversity. So with sexual reproduction, especially in a changing environment, there might be, let's say, certain alleles that are rare that might actually be beneficial. And they can be transmitted to offspring and throughout the population much more easily during sex. And so diversity, in some cases, is very good. In a population, if there's no change in the environment or whatever, it's no big deal. But if there is a change, having a lot of diversity can allow organisms to respond in terms of evolution. The thing is, like I mentioned about corn, most of the corn that we grow is actually for cattle feed and things like that. And what you get is you're actually planting clones of corn. You have genetically modified corn that has certain traits for the cattle. It's grown as a monoculture. What that means is there's very little variation in corn crops, and if anything came along that might, like a pathogen, it might wipe out all these corn crops. In fact, that's exactly what's happening right now with bananas. Anybody in here likes bananas? A few people? Okay. The banana that most of us eat is called Cavendish. it was bred for that selective breeding. There are all different kinds of bananas out there, actually. Many different varieties and species, in fact. Anybody ever eat plantains? Okay. If you like Caribbean food, take these plantains. They're a little bit more starchy than other bananas, but you can fry them up. They're really delicious. So there's all these different varieties, but mainly we eat Cavendish. And Cavendish, there's very little diversity in Cavendish. Well, there's a new fungus that's actually is attacking Cavendish. And Cavendish bananas, that variety has no immunity to it. And so once that gets into, let's say, a plantation of Cavendish bananas, it wipes everything out. So right now they actually have to work on creating a new strain of banana that has many of the same properties. So one of the things about Cavendish, like many crops, you can store it for a long time. It won't go bad. It travels easily. It doesn't bruise. The tomato is a perfect example of that. The tomato you buy in a store usually tastes like nothing, okay? And Cavendish is okay, but there's a lot of other bananas that are much more delicious than that. The thing is, they're racing against the clock to actually try to create a banana that's resistant to this fungus that's wiping out Cavendish worldwide. So one of the problems with genetically modified or selectively bred is that there's very little diversity, and if something is susceptible to a pathogen or a parasite, like I am right now, then there's usually very little recourse in terms of fixing that problem. One way, perhaps, though, with genetically modified food is perhaps they can find out, let's say, another banana strain might be resistant to this fungus. They might identify the gene, and then they might use transgenic technology to put that gene, an allele, into Cavendish or something like Cavendish, and the end result is you've then got a genetically modified banana that allows you to grow it without succumbing to this fungus. Okay. So this is the kind of diversity I'm talking about. In terms of corn, let's say, on the left is let's say, genetically modified corn. All the corn grows the same way. It's got the same exact genes. Maybe a few different mutations, but not anything to speak of. And if a pathogen or a parasite comes along and the plant is susceptible to it, then the whole crop is completely lost. So one of the problems with genetic modification or selective breeding is you're breeding out the diversity. And in that way, those crop plants are susceptible to being wiped out and no longer being useful. So that's mainly what I was going to talk about for today. One thing we can do